So, here in our continuing series on Buddhism, today I want to take up the question, what is enlightenment? Because enlightenment is at the core of all things Buddhism. Remember, the word Buddha came from the Sanskrit root bud, to awaken. So at the very center of all of the different kinds of Buddhism is this one idea that ordinary consciousness is a kind of dream, a kind of program, a conditioned existence that we can rise up out of into a fuller, more realized, more liberated form of consciousness. And it's described by these metaphors as enlightenment or awakening, and we have to figure out what that means if we're going to understand Buddhism at all. And yet it's difficult to talk about enlightenment. You know, we pore through the literature, we consult with lifelong practitioners, and I'm afraid the traveler's tales are a little murky. And we're up against that idea that always confronts us in all of our religious studies, namely ineffability. Those higher realized states of consciousness are experiential, not conceptual. And in the end, they can't be talked about down here at the level of ordinary consciousness. So we're stuck with metaphors and, fingers pointing at the moon. So let's do what we can to keep this simple and unpack this in as clear a way as possible. Maybe we'll start here. Think about it. When we were born, they brought us home. We were in these amazing bodies with these sensory apparatus and cognitive capabilities, and we began to take in perception, and we learned language, and when they taught us a language, that carried with it a worldview, a value system. And these are the beautiful things, these are the ugly things, these are the true things, these are the false things. We were told what was what. And our whole worldview was imparted to us by, I think, all these well-intentioned sources, teachers and ministers and parents and society and culture and all of that. I don't think it was a nefarious conditioning process. It's just what happens when you take form in the world of embodied forms and you try to piece it all together conceptually. So our worldview was largely handed to us. We didn't really choose it. And then you grow up and you become an adult and you start asking questions and you begin living what Socrates called the examined life. Remember, he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So in the philosophic life, we start wondering, on what grounds should I believe everything that I have been taught? Or as Descartes put it, what do I really know with certainty? So the quest begins for wisdom, for knowledge, for truth. And this is a universal philosophical quest. And Buddhism is just one of the many responses to that longing for knowing, that longing for wisdom. And maybe another good place to start for us in our inquiry into what is enlightenment is with the word nirvana. The word nirvana in Sanskrit is, I think, synonymous with awakening and with enlightenment. Let's just make all three of those words synonyms: awakening, enlightenment, and now nirvana. Originally, in its pure literal meaning, nirvana in Sanskrit means no wind. Nir is a negating prefix, and vana means wind or air that is moving. So nirvana implies stillness. Sometimes it's translated as to blow out, like to blow out a flame. So in its root sense, nirvana is a one-word poem denoting stillness, calm, serenity. The opposite of the state of consciousness that we're always in, agitation and fear. That craving and fearing and agitated state that you and I call thinking. So what if nirvana, initially anyway, in original Buddhism, simply referred to a state of consciousness characterized by stillness and serenity? Think about a pond out in the woods on a very, very windy day. And the wind is blowing and the water is choppy and the waves on the pond are swirling around, and the water is so agitated that all of the silt and mud on the bottom of the pond has kicked up into the water and is suspended in the water, and it's muddy and murky and it's a mess. And then imagine the wind calming down and becoming completely still. Soon the pond has gone to glass, and the water has become so still that all of the silt is settled back down to the bottom of the pond. And this is going to take some time, by the way. But as the stillness takes over and the mirrored surface of the pond reflects every cloud in the sky, and you can see all the way to the bottom of the pond and see every pebble, with stillness comes clarity and depth. And that conveys, I think, what is essentially meant by nirvana, a state of consciousness of clarity and depth that is only possible when we release our attachment to the agitated state of craving and fear that characterizes our ordinary existence. So, I don't know about you, but I have two lists in my head going all the time, and I bet you do too. Let's think about consciousness for a minute. One list is all the things I want, and it's a long list, and some of it's sort of trivial, like I want a cup of coffee, and some of it's grave and intense, like I want world peace. And I want more money, and I want health, and I want all my friends to do well. And there's all these things that I want. I want the sun to come out. And then there's this other list, and I bet you have this list too. Here's all the things I don't want, my aversions. I don't want skin cancer, so I wear a hat when I go outside. I don't want my car to break down, so I keep it maintained and my phone charged up. I have a long list of things I don't want, and I have a long list of things that I want. And life is kind of the maintenance, isn't it, of those two lists. You try to bring the things you want closer to you, and you try to keep the things you don't want away from you. And that's life. Let me ask you a question now. With those two lists in mind, your two lists, how would it feel right here in your gut? How would it feel if both of those lists suddenly vanished? Now there's nothing you want, there's nothing you need. You've shifted from the consciousness of scarcity and craving to the consciousness of gratitude and appreciation. And there's nothing that you are afraid of. Anything could happen and you would be okay. You would accept it with equanimity. The arising and fading of form is fine. And so, with that exercise, we catch a glimpse of the possibility of nirvanic consciousness. The simple surrender, what in Hinduism we call renunciation, letting go of attachment to outcomes. And what also happens in enlightenment, the Buddhist literature tells us, is we begin to think less and less about ourselves. You know, there's that wonderful Tibetan Buddhist saying, want to go to hell? Think about yourself. Want to go to heaven? Think about other people. When in the enlightened state, in the nirvanic state, we look out at the world, we see the deep and real interdependency and interconnectedness of all energy, all consciousness, and all forms. And in that beautiful ballet, my own needs and wants pales and shrinks in relative comparison to the grandeur of it all. And I become slightly less self-obsessed, and my joy and my freedom begins to increase. I realize my inherent wellness and I realize the way in which I am supported, and I don't have to panic all the time about everything. You know, Jesus says so often in the Gospels, fear not. And in the Sermon on the Mount, those beautiful anti-anxiety passages, you know, why are you worried all the time? Look at the lilies of the field, or look at the birds, that they don't worry, they don't toil, they don't store up. And look how they're supported and taken care of. Do you not think that you are supported and taken care of? And so another element of enlightenment is karuna, or compassion. We begin to see the suffering of others as our own suffering, because that is what compassion means, from the Greek passion, or suffering, and calm, meaning with. So when we have compassion, we suffer with another. In another word that fits pretty well here, empathy. The suffering of the other is felt as my own suffering. This is a natural outcome of enlightenment as well. As my self-centeredness begins to decrease, I suddenly am just as concerned about you as I am about me. So with these words, we try to paint a picture that brings into somewhat clearer focus this nebulous idea of nirvana, or enlightenment. And throughout Buddhism, there are many examples. In Mahayana Buddhism, they're called bodhisattvas. The bodhisattva, the illumined being, is like the Buddha, someone who has one foot in nirvana and one foot in the world. They're kind of bridge beings. They exist in nirvanic consciousness, but they're not off on a mountaintop just blissing out. They're back in the marketplace. They're back in the street. They're back in the dusty world, serving, healing who and what they can heal. That wonderful Jewish phrase, tikkun olam, to heal the world. This is our dharma. This is our purpose, to participate in the sustenance of the world. This is what all the spiritual teachers call us to. And out of the enlightened state, the bodhisattva commits to the alleviation of the suffering of all sentient beings. And that's held up in Buddhism as a kind of ideal. That's the purpose of life. It's why we're here, to participate in the healing of the world. I mean, I don't need to tell you, look around. There is woundedness everywhere. And when we attend to the wounds of others, our own wounds begin to heal mysteriously. As the Dalai Lama put it, compassionate action is the highest form of self-interest. Compassionate action is the highest form of self-interest, because when we are virtuous for others, our own virtue naturally expands and brightens. So as we continue this series of inquiries into the wonderful philosophy of Buddhism, the next question we need to think about is, well, what if this enlightenment business is real? What if there's some merit to this? Then what does an enlightened person know? Looking through the eyes of enlightenment, how does reality appear? How does experience unfold? So that's the question we take up in our next video. What does an enlightened person know?